Thank you for the delightful presentation, and thank you so much for inviting me. So what I would like to do is to reflect upon the art in situ experience at Skokloster Castle and Hallwyl House. Skokloster Castle, you see it here to your right or left, and that is a country house situated outside Stockholm, about an hour's drive from Stockholm. And then you see Hallwyl House, which is a townhouse from the late 1800s, situated in the very center of Stockholm. And these two historic house museums have uncontrolled inner climate. And Hallwyl House has very dry inner climate, and the majority of the artworks are paintings on wood. And at Skokloster Castle, the inner climate is very humid, and the majority of the artworks are actually paintings on canvas. So, but the paintings, the artworks, they are where they are. They are located in situ in these two historic house museums. And Skokloster Castle and Hallwyl House are historic house museums of different character. So I would like to compare the art in situ experience between these two houses. And Hallwyl House was built then in the 1890s, and it is a collector's house. It's very closely knit to its collector, Wilhelmina von Hallwyl. And Skokloster Castle has been an attraction for visitors ever since it was first built, and the construction of the castle began in 1654. Despite its reputation as a Baroque time capsule, the paintings and the objects, they have been moved around at Skokloster House constantly over the centuries and by the different owners. And it was also subtly enhanced the Baroque character of the interiors and the furnishing in the 19th century by the different owners in that era. So I think that this image illustrates very well the impressive time span at Skokloster Castle. In the foreground, you see a part of the cemetery by the Skokloster Church, which was the site of the medieval convent for the nuns of the Cistercian order. And in the middle, you see the old manor where Count Carl Gustaf Wrangel was born. And he inherited the Skokloster estate from his mother, Margareta Grip, who you see here on this portrait from the early 1600s by an unknown artist. And the Skokloster estate was presented to his mother, Margareta Grip, as a mourning gift. And that was the gift traditionally presented to a bride on her first morning as a married woman. And in the background then, you see a part of the great Skokloster Castle, erected then from 1654 by Carl Gustaf Wrangel and his wife Anna Margareta von Haugwitz, who was then the very first chatelaine at the great castle. And this castle would remain in ownership by the descendants of Carl Gustaf Wrangel until 1967, and then it was sold to the state. And here is the cover of the coming publication. And the coming publication and exhibition will highlight the agency of the women at Skokloster, from the nuns in the convent to 1967, the last chatelaine. So it's that very impressive time span that we will cover in the exhibition as well as in the publication. And at Skokloster Castle, the women, they have been invisible in the museum narrative. And that's quite interesting because they are not invisible in the castle. They are seen everywhere because their portraits are on display everywhere. But in the narrative, they have been invisible. And also, of course, the traces and the documentation of these women are difficult to discover and interpret in sometimes. But they may be found in documents. So with this publication and exhibition, we want to make them accessible, their histories accessible to a wider audience. But then what I would like to elaborate around in this talk are what did the owners wish to communicate through their art collections. And how do the paintings relate to the other collections and settings? And what is the importance of the art in situ experience to understand, analyze, and read the historic house? Because the interiors, the paintings, the tapestries, the furniture, the decorative objects are contextualized at Skokloster as well as at Hallwyl House. Each historic house is an integrated whole. It does not tell one story or history, but countless of different histories. And of course, these houses may be interpreted from a multitude of viewpoints: architecture, interiors, adornments, fixtures, paintings, and decorative objects, as well as the house in terms of the lives lived in it. But now, let us take a closer look at the intentions of the first proprietor at Skokloster Castle and how the artworks relate to the integrated whole. Skokloster Castle was commissioned by Count Carl Gustav Wrangel, and in 1653 he commissioned drawings from the German architect Caspar Vogel. Wrangel and his wife Anna Margareta von Haugwitz, they were on the site at Skokloster when the construction of the new great house began in 1654. Wrangel would then supervise the building process from Germany because that is where he spent most of his time. The family had a large court in Pomerania, and he was in frequent correspondence with the building engineer. And on this equestrian portrait on display in the Count's antechambre at Skokloster Castle, we see Count Carl Gustav Wrangel depicted in a situation he was very familiar with. He spent 25 of his adult years at war, and behind him we see the banners of the Swedish troops. This is one of the earliest equestrian portraits in Sweden by a non-royal person, painted and depicted in this huge size. But below the equestrian portrait there is another picture, and you see a detail here on the slide. This is an inscription written in French, and it is celebrating the triumphs of Wrangel, summarizing his achievements. In other words, he had his CV attached to the equestrian portrait. His military successes led him to the rank of Commander of the Army, Field Marshal, member of the Privy Council, and General Governor in Pomerania. So it was Carl Gustav Wrangel who shaped the core of the Skokloster collection. His intentions, Carl Gustav Wrangel's intentions, they are quite clearly expressed in his will that he wrote in 1673. The castle was to remain in the perpetual memory of him. He is quite clear about that. And he had planned the Skokloster Castle to be the grand Wrangel family estate, to be passed from father to son, but none of his sons survived to adult age. 4 daughters would live to adult age, and we see the eldest daughter, Margareta Juliana Wrangel, here on this portrait by David Klöcker Ehrenstrahl, a Swedish painter of German origin. And he wanted his daughter and her husband to inherit Skokloster Castle. She is not mentioned in the will, though. Her husband's name is mentioned in the will. She was under the guardianship of her husband. But she would then, when she became a widow, make the decision that the Skokloster Castle would be entailed, the whole estate would be entailed to be inherited by the eldest son. So she preserved the castle as a memorial to her father, Carl Gustav Wrangel. She would nurture the memory of her father at Skokloster, and in doing so, she set the tone for the future generations. And although very few objects can be linked directly to her, the chair, the hourglass you see here on this picture, these are the few objects that we may link directly to her, or 2 of the few objects we can link directly to her. The estate inventories at Skokloster give us valuable information about how the collections were when they would come to Skokloster Castle. So they serve as a window to the history of the castle, even though they are snapshots of that day afternoon when the estate inventory was written, but they go back to 1672. And this is the guest room, or one of guest rooms, several guest rooms in the guest room apartment. This is a space that has been remodeled, refurnished several times over the centuries. So that is typical also of Skokloster, the collections they have moved around. And here we see Abraham Brahe. He was married twice. And we see his wives here also. And he was the first male heir to inherit the entailed Skokloster castle. And he continued his mother's work to turn it into a memorial of his grandfather. But he opened Skokloster as a museum in 1702. Not, of course, in the modern sense of the word, but a select audience would be invited to marvel at the collections. And here you see a lithograph from the 1860s and a picture of the bedchamber of the Countess Anna Margareta von Haugwitz as it is seen today. The lithograph they were released, these series of lithographs in the 1860s by a Swedish artist, Carl-Johan Billmark. But these lithographs would contribute to the promotion of Skokloster as national identity and a national icon. It was, and Sweden's glorious past of the 17th century. I think also it's very interesting to compare these images because you see the continuity of the painting above the fireplace, depicting two cockatoos and a parrot. And we know through correspondence that Carl Gustav Wrangel, he ordered birds of this kind as a gift to his wife. So most likely this artwork has been on display since the 1670s there. And then at Skokloster, it will give you a sense of the past, family bonds and connections, because the portraits are seen everywhere. And there have always been, since the 1600s, very strong bonds between Sweden and the Netherlands. You see a delightful portrait of the chatelaine Eva Bjelke as a young girl. She was depicted by Martin Meitens in 1683. And he was living in Sweden and working in Sweden and has been very important since he educated several Swedish important artists. But now let us jump in time to Hallwyl House and the intentions of the collections and owner. We see the facade of Hallwyl House. It was built between 1893 to 98. And we see also on this image, the other image, the back of Wilhelmina von Hallwyl. Here she is eagerly receiving objects arriving to Stockholm by train, about to enter her collections. Because Hallwyl House was tailor-made for her collections. And the house was created to her specifications. Wilhelmina von Hallwyl, she was a wealthy cosmopolitan and she felt at home in the big cities. She traveled extensively. She was a passionate collector and arguably sometimes an obsessive collector. And transforming Hallwyl House and the collections into a museum became her life's project. She expressed that she wanted to present a material as rich and diverse as possible to illuminate her own time as well as cultures of the past. The collection would then eventually develop into an ethnological project, and items for everyday use would be kept, preserved, and recorded. And by doing so, she wanted to preserve the era she lived in. She wanted to preserve a way of life for posterity, the values, the norms and aesthetics of her time. Here is the great drawing room at Hallwyl House on the principal floor, and I think that this space is a very good example of how the house was tailor-made for the collections, because the room was designed to accommodate the tapestries, this suite of tapestries that you see here. And so her idea of transforming Hallwyl House into a museum began to evolve very early. The concept of the future Hallwyl Museum started to take shape the same year as she and her husband moved into Hallwyl House in 1898. And here's the smoking room right next to the great drawing room. And returning from the hunt by Abraham Hondius, it was placed on display as a centerpiece above the sofa. It was a gift from Wilhelmina von Hallwyl's mother. So she this was before they moved into Hallwyl House, so she would begin to build the collection of Dutch and Flemish artworks at Hallwyl House only after they had moved in. So this is, together with a few other artworks, Dutch and Flemish artworks at Hallwyl House, this is one of the cornerstone of the collection. But was Hallwyl House always a museum with a function of a home while preparing for the future museum, or was it primarily a home? These are interesting questions to ask. Wilhelmina von Hallwyl, she had no formal education. She was self-taught. And in a way, her travels and visits to museums became her university. And she studied the old masters when she was traveling. She went to the Rijksmuseum, the Sixth Collection in Amsterdam. She visited Mauritshuis here in The Hague. Only to mention a few, she traveled all over Europe, and she has also an extensive library at Hallwyl House. But it's interesting to study Wilhelmina von Hallwyl from a professional perspective. Here we see her in this role that she would have when she lived at Hallwyl House. She developed the infrastructure of the future museum, and she managed the staff of experts, photographers, secretaries, and artists. And it was she who decided that the collection would also be meticulously documented and catalogued, including the mundane objects relating to the daily life lived in the house. So the house was donated to the state in 1920, but in the deed of gift it was also clearly stated that she and her husband could remain at Hallwyl House for the rest of their days. It would not be activated until both of them were gone. So her husband passed in 1921, she passed in 1930. So with a combination of visionary ideas, hard work, and a tremendous amount of money, Wilhelmina von Hallwyl created the Hallwyl Museum. This was one of the wealthiest families in Sweden, I shall also say. The museum opened in 1938. But the work resulted in the Hallwyl catalog, and you see it here, comprising 78 volumes. Wilhelmina von Hallwyl once said that, quote, "It is bitter that a woman shall not be acknowledged for what she has created," end of quote. It was Wilhelmina von Hallwyl who took a curatorial role at Hallwyl House. She chose what to collect, how and where to display the artworks and objects. Here we see the picture gallery on the top floor at Hallwyl House, housing the bulk of the paintings collection. This is the home of the core of the art collection at Hallwyl House. And this room was an addition formed out in the attic in 1904-05, when the art collections was in a state of rapid growth. And Wilhelmina von Hallwyl, she had a very clear intention with her collection as an integrated whole. And this is expressed in the deed of gift as well as in the Hallwyl catalog, because these are our main sources to understand the intentions of Wilhelmina von Hallwyl. And she stated that the Hallwyl collection must for all future be located in situ in the Hallwyl Palace. And I think also that it would lose much of its historical value if it was not on display in situ. But let's go back to Skokloster Castle now. And now, finally, let us compare the art in situ experience at Skokloster Castle and Hallwyl House. There are nearly 1,000 works of art at Skokloster Castle, and of these, nearly 600 are portraits. The portrait collection at Skokloster is an interesting example of an agile collection. It's been built by one generation only to be rebuilt by the next. The portrait collection represents at the same time constant change and continuity. The portraits are constantly seen with new eyes. And that is also something that we have done in the coming publication and exhibition with that work, which started in 2017. We asked new questions to the portrait collection, and by doing so, we have gained so much more knowledge about several of the portraits and their sitters. For a long time, several of these women, they were only a name and a face on a portrait. We did not know that much about them. But Anna Margareta von Haugwitz, the wife of Wrangel, who we see here on this portrait, she is a person who has been researched for quite some time before we started this project. But here she is portrayed by Anselm van Hulle around 1649 to 50, and in the background the Nuremberg City Hall. Wrangel was attending the following up of the Peace Congress at that time in the city, and he commissioned the full-length portrait of Anna Margareta that year. It has been conserved by paintings conservator Ann-Katrin Rotlind for the coming exhibition. And Anna Margareta, she can be traced in the source material. You see here also on the slide the printed eulogy or the printed funeral speech, which is kept in the Skokloster library. And in this, we learn that before she died, she described her life by her own hand. So part of this eulogy is actually written by herself. But she was a woman of great agency, and she managed the economy at the family estates, had great influence. So the significant role that these aristocratic women have, how important they were, and the important role they played must not be neglected. But here we see also an artwork in the Skokloster Castle collections. Wrangel bought many artworks through his agents. So during the first half of the 17th century, the commercial connections between Sweden and the Netherlands were being developed. And his agent first in Amsterdam and then in The Hague, Harald Appelboom, he bought artworks for Carl Gustav Wrangel. Appelboom was a diplomat in the Netherlands. And he bought this artwork, this landscape by Jan Steen in 1651. And in the correspondence, in the kept correspondence between Wrangel and his agent, he would express how pleased he was with the 4 artworks he had bought from this young and promising artist. And but only one of these 4 artworks remain at Skokloster Castle today, because about 150 artworks from the 770 paintings that used to be in Wrangel's collection, they remain at the castle today. But then also the marriage alliances have been very important at Skokloster Castle. The Jacob Jordans, the return of the Holy Family from Egypt, used to decorate the walls in a palace in Stockholm in the 1600s. But then, through a marriage alliance, it would come into the Skokloster Castle collections, and it was transferred to Skokloster in 1800s. Joseph and his brothers, signed by Van den Neekoot, it was transferred to Skokloster in the 1840s. So these are only 2 examples of this collection that clearly show how the artworks were constantly moved around between their family estates. And some of the artworks also originate from other European collections. During the 30 Years' War, the Swedish troops looted artworks in Europe, so some of the artworks would come to the collection that way. But I would like to call the in situ experience, art in situ experience at Skokloster of the 17th century artworks as a primary art in situ experience, because the core of the 17th century collection has been kept intact over the centuries, and you experience the artworks in a 17th century setting. This image here is a clip from Hallwyl House, and it describes, there was so much written about Hallwyl House when they moved in. The writer stated that when you enter this magnificent home, you experience a sense of joy. You get the impression that the furniture and objects never had any other purpose than that. But they made very long journeys to enter the Hallwyl collection. The core of the collection is on display in the picture gallery. The arrangement, evocative of both the 17th century and the turn of the past century, is in itself of great interest today, and also quite rare, I would say. So Wilhelmina's intention with this space was to offer an almost encyclopedic experience of the Dutch and Flemish Old Master paintings. So I would like to describe the art in situ experience of the 17th century artworks at Hallwyl House as a secondary in situ experience of these artworks. But yet at the same time, you experience how these artworks were collected and arranged at the turn of the 20th century. So Wilhelmina acquired most of her artworks through the Bukowski's auction house, like this piece by Katarina Backer. It was bought through her agent in Bukowski's, who bought it in turn from his agent by Friedrich Müller Company in Amsterdam in 1904. And this was an artwork that would come into the Hallwyl collection through her mother's collection. And on display in the billiard room is Pomona by Franz Flores, and it was looted in 1648 by the Swedish troops for the Queen Christina, and then Wilhelmina acquired the artwork at an auction at Bukowski's. So I have only given you a few glimpses of the rich and diverse collections at Skokloster and Hallwyl House and the art in situ experience at these two historic house museums. But I think that the art collections at Skokloster and Hallwyl House, they are so closely knit to the houses, so it is of great historical value that these artworks are on display in situ at these two historic house museums. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.